Hello, hello, hello. This is Kenny Perkins, aka your cancer guy. And again, you know what I always say. We have another phenomenal guest. Listen, we traveled for this guest, right? We traveled to Wisconsin, right? Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Sometimes people think of Wisconsin, you think of cheese and things like that, right? We think of food, we think of maybe a cherry tree or things like that. But guess what? Our topic today is on food. It's going to be not just on cheese itself, but food overall. As you're going through cancer, whether it be for surgery or for radiation or chemo, or you're finishing, you're going into survivorship, how does food play a major role in all of this, right? Because we all have to eat. And maybe we had habits before even being diagnosed. We were living our lives and doing the things that we want, eating the things we want, but no one really sat down with us, maybe talk to us about the types of food that can benefit us. Well, today we're going to change that. Today we're going to dive into it. We're going to dive into how food affects you, how it can help you along your cancer journey and beyond. Because I think that part of it is a missing piece. It's a missing piece. And the thing is, it's interesting. Why? Why is that missing? Because we eat every day. We have to. Whereas human beings, in order to sustain our life, we need to nourish ourselves. So how does this part get missed? We're going to talk about that. And I'm going to tell you, for me, food is a big deal. One, food is a very social thing, right? I mean, we go out with our friends and we eat and we hang out, and what restaurant we're going to go to, food plays a major role, right? Food, it does that. And then for someone like me, I consider myself a jack of all trades, but a master of none, right? So I've landed in the fitness industry and at one point in my life and where I was a competitor. And so the power of food is amazing because in order to transform my body, I had to eat certain foods. I had to do certain things. So if food has that type of power where it can help transform, help create muscle, help create, a certain look, how much more important is it as you're going through treatments so that it can help you? These building blocks. How do you use food as a ally, right? And as you're going through this, well, take no more time away. We're going to jump into it. Listen, we have a nutritionist on here who is an advocate for that. She is amazing. Her name is Alison Tierney. Let's bring her to the show here. Oh, listen to
Thank
that
you so much for
introduction.
having me.
Alison, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to have you on our show. And thank you so much for coming on here to help us along the way and seeing how powerful nutrition is. But enough for me talking. Alison, tell our listeners a little bit about you and how you landed in this role and what you're doing in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Kenny. It's an honor to be here. Wow, how I got here and a little bit about me. Well, like you said, my name's Alison Tierney, and I'm a registered dietitian. And I'm also board certified in oncology nutrition, which is kind of the specialty of registered dietitians. And I've been in this space for over a decade now. And what really brought me to be an oncology dietitian was an extensive family history of cancer. Actually, my nutrition interest actually started very similar maybe to yours from sports or athletic performance. And how could I fuel my body in order to enhance my performance athletically? I played all the way through college. But then when I was in college, unfortunately, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was a freshman. And my grandfather, unfortunately, was diagnosed with liver cancer when I was a senior. My one grandmother passed away from lung cancer before I was born. My other grandma was a breast and uterine survivor. And my godmother was also, who's my mom's cousin, was also a breast cancer survivor. So there was a tremendous amount of diagnoses that happened in my young adulthood. And I started to wonder how nutrition could play a role in to help reduce the risk of developing the disease. But how could nutrition help support them during the course of treatment and in the survivorship? And so I actually I have a degree in business from college. And then I decided to go back to school to become a dietitian, got another degree in nutrition and dietetics, and asked all of my professors and anybody that would listen, essentially, that I wanted to be an oncology dietitian and get any experience that I could, because there's not that much experience out there, because there's not that many oncology dietitians. And I was very fortunate to land an internship in outpatient oncology with a well-known National Cancer Center. They hired me full-time after college, and I became an outpatient oncology dietitian, which was exactly my dream. And after that, I moved to a different cancer center that was closer to home and grew and ran a nutrition program there. And it was incredible to be able to work with these patients one-on-one as they're going through their different treatments and to help support them through this education and this knowledge. However, a big thing about my own story is that I always say that my career took an ironic twist when I was diagnosed with cancer as well at the age of 33. And because of that, I feel like as an oncology dietitian and a cancer patient myself, I have a very unique perspective and a very unique lens that I can offer to patients while they're going through chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery, because I've been through it. And I've been through the challenges of trying to eat during those treatments and how difficult it can be. So a lot of tips and tricks that not only come from my professional experience, but also from my personal experience. And today I still work with patients that are going through treatment, but also into survivorship, and show and talk about and teach them how nutrition can play an incredible complementary role to help support their bodies before, during, and after cancer treatment. And when it comes to after cancer treatment, trying to reduce the risk of recurrence with the things that we can control, because we can't control everything when it comes to cancer, right? There are many uncontrollables. For example, when I was diagnosed at the age of 33, I automatically qualified for genetic testing, which did come back positive. So I do have a genetic mutation, and it makes a little bit more sense with the extensive family history and the young diagnoses. So I always talk about how, like, yes, I do have this genetic mutation that unfortunately drastically increased my risk and will increase my risk of further cancers down the road, but I can't control that, right? I can control what I eat, how I move my body. I can control my mental health and my physical health and all those things. And so it's a matter of trying to control the controllables and let the rest go. And that's really how I think of nutrition in this whole process.
Wow. Well, Alison, that was a mouthful.
It
That was
usually
quite a bit. All these little innuendos with food. That was a mouthful. Yeah. You know, Alison, I tell you, it's, for someone who has sat in the seat and said, oh my goodness, how is this nutrition going to affect me? You know, what was your thought process as you were going through your cancer journey as far as nutrition was concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's interesting because I had that unique perspective to know, like, the research and the data, right? Like, I knew the information about how nutrition could play a role. And so actually, when I was first diagnosed, so actually what ended up happening is I had completed breastfeeding my second child, and 10 days later happened to have an annual OBGYN exam. And that's where we found the lump. And we actually didn't do anything about it initially because breasts change a lot during pregnancy and nursing, et cetera. But then when I went home and kept feeling the lump, it was one of those, I really felt anxious every time that I touched it. And that was enough for me to be like, I think I need to get this checked out. I knew my family history. I had worked with a lot of really young breast cancer survivors before, so I knew I wasn't too young to have cancer. And so anyways, I reached back out to my doctor and said, I really just need some peace of mind of this because I'm concerned about it. So thankfully, she ordered an ultrasound right away, and the ultrasound led to a mammogram, which led to a biopsy all within the same day and a diagnosis 48 hours later. But the radiologist had told me, I'm pretty confident I know that this is cancer. We just need to confirm it with a biopsy. So between the mammogram and the biopsy, it was amazing how they got it all in one day. I know there's a lot of people that have to wait a really long time in order to, have the progression and figuring out what this diagnosis is, right? But she goes, okay, we have an opening in the afternoon for you to have your biopsy. Why don't you go take a breather, get some lunch, right? And at this moment, you're just like, it's hard to think about anything, let alone thinking about eating, right? But I was with my mom and I said, I want to go here. And I knew it was a place that had a really great salad bar and all sorts of, nutritious things. And I told my mom, this is where I want to go. And I tell people it wasn't about the fact that loading up my plate with these beautiful, nutritious foods that we know contain anti-cancer properties. It wasn't about the fact that I thought that eating this plate was going to change the outcome of my biopsy by any means, right? We know food is powerful, but food is powerful in a long-term game, I guess you can say. And it wasn't about what was that, it was about the control of it, right? So when we are going through treatment, when we're going through this process, there's so much that's out of our control. So my thought and my approach to nutrition and the other parts of this whole process of my treatment was really about trying to focus on the things that I could control. Right. And that was my thought process most of the time through treatment. What can I do to help myself? What can I do to help make myself stronger throughout this? And when I was diagnosed, I had a 15-month-old baby and a 4-year-old little girl, right? I had to still parent. My husband is amazing and fantastic and took on this huge role of so many different things while I was going through treatment. You're still a mom. You still have to get up and keep going. And how can I support my body through doing that? And thankfully, I was very successful. I did really well throughout the course of chemo. And that's not to say that there weren't hard days or there weren't hardships, but it was more of a matter. I reminded myself when things got really hard, what would it be like if I wasn't doing this? What state would I be in if I wasn't putting this extra effort into helping myself? And I think that's part of the reason of my success of going through treatment is really being able to support myself through that process.
Sure. Alison, it's, for anyone listening in, that's quite a bit, for anyone, one, to have a 4-year-old and a 15-month-year-old and trying to juggle that with a cancer diagnosis. And so for anyone listening, it's already hard enough to just maintain a nutritional, regimen, let alone to have the responsibilities around it. And I don't want to leave out your husband because he also needs the attention and things like that as a family member, right? So it's quite mind-boggling sometimes to see, because for you, it just rolls off your tongue. It's so easily, but the way you've done it. But walk us through some of the regimens you put together in order for you to be successful during your cancer treatments. Because we talk about the value of why nutrition is important, but where do we start? How do we change? Is this a change that we need to do right away? Walk us through a little bit of all of that. I'm sorry, I know I asked multiple questions, but just walk us through a daily regimen on how you prepared yourself nutritionally.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when it comes to how do we start, do we need to take this all on at one time? To be honest, it's very individualized. And that is how I work with patients too, right? It depends on where they're starting from and what types of side effects and things that they are experiencing and how do we change there. So it is not a cookie cutter, just because Alison did this, that everybody else should do this, right? Because people have different types of support systems in their family. I feel very lucky to have my husband and my parents are close by and so forth. So the support system that someone has makes a difference, right? What type of treatment and side effects they're going to experience, and also the resources that they have available to them, right? Unfortunately, everything is not equal across the board in terms of if we have access to certain healthy foods and so forth. So it's very, very dependent on an individual. So with that being said, I'm happy to share kind of how I set up, but also keeping in mind that just because it worked for me and I had ability to do it doesn't mean that it's the same thing for everybody else. So one of the first important...
Thank you for that, Alison. Yeah. I didn't want to cut you off, but I wanted to pause that because everyone is different. Their diagnosis may be different. It may be breast cancer, maybe prostate cancer, with lung cancer, whatever whatever your diagnosis may be, everyone is just different as individuals. And so I love that you're not talking about taking a cookie cutter diet plan and then just implementing it. No, everyone needs to have a specialized regimen. And I think based upon what you like and what you're trying to achieve. And so I'm glad that you paused that. And I'm glad that you said that. And then the next thing I heard, I hope you guys listened to this. I asked about nutrition, and she instantly went into a support group, okay? Having the people around you who support you. She also went into, one of the things that we need to do is our resources, so did you pick up on that? These things are not just about nutrition. It's about who's around you and the resources that you have at your hand. So let's listen in on that. Sorry, Alison, I didn't want to cut you off, but you dropped some gems and I wanted to highlight them.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And thank you for highlighting them too, because I think that's something that's so interesting. And, even if someone has the same breast cancer diagnosis, right? What treatment they might get is slightly different, or when they had surgery, or if they're having surgery, right? For example, I had a double mastectomy and a deep flap reconstruction, which is when you use your own tissue to recreate the breast. So I have an incision from one hip across my belly all the way across to the other side, right? And that's my abdomen, but also, I had incisions and so forth for on my chest for my breast. But that changed how I was able to do things too, because I wasn't able to pick up my 15-year-old daughter for 15 weeks, right? I wasn't able to change her diaper on the changing table, right? And the resources and the ability of those things changed. So yeah, absolutely. It is so dependent on the individual. And I often talk to my patients a lot, like, even though I'm nutrition, I'm diet, there's so much that comes into that, right? And sometimes when I'm talking with my clients, like, wow, I feel like we didn't talk about nutrition at all today. And I was like, well, we talked about the things that impact your nutrition, right? Your stress. Like, if you're carrying a ton of stress and you don't have the time to be able to put a little effort into being able to cut your veggies or do those types of things, or if you're so fatigued that you don't have the ability to do that, we have to think about other strategies to make that happen. How do we reduce your stress? How do we improve your fatigue so that we can make these healthier nutrition choices that are going to further support you? Because it's a really vicious cycle, right? Let's just use fatigue as an example. If we're tired, right, which 100% of people experience fatigue during cancer treatment, right? To different varying degrees. Yeah, it's the main side effect of any cancer treatment. So if we're fatigued, how likely are we going to choose a really supportive nutrition choice? Not really, right? We're going to reach for what's easy, right? And sometimes when we reach for what's easy isn't going to be the thing that's going to give us the energy that we need. But that was something that was easy, right? Then we're more fatigued. And it's just this cycle that continues and continues. How do we break that cycle? And there's other inputs other than nutrition that need to help break that cycle. So those are things that I think about. And one of the things that I did experience difficulty eating at some point. And I wasn't hungry. I knew the need for it. And I literally said to my husband, because I knew that this would make a difference for me, is I said, I'm struggling to eat. And what I need from you is to put the food in front of me. And I promise that if you put it in front of me, I will make an effort to eat it. And what that did is that took my mental space to clear up to decide what to eat. It cleared up the mental or the physical energy of creating that food or, putting it together so that I could focus on just that one thing, which was honestly delivering the food to my mouth. Right. So when I'm working with patients, we have to think about all those other pieces to it. And here, yes, I'm a dietitian, know the importance of eating, and I was struggling to eat. So I had to come up with, how am I going to do that for myself? Right. And it took support from someone else. So that is one thing that I had to think about during treatment, was like, what do I need to encourage myself to do that? And that was effective for me. The other thing is that I really tried to set myself up mentally in a good space as much as possible. So I had chemotherapy. I had 12 cycles of chemotherapy, and I had them on weekly. So every Thursday, I had chemotherapy, and my daughter was in kindergarten, and we live zero point 0.6 miles from school, so not super far by any means. But it was my focus that on my day of chemo, it was really important for me to walk my daughter to school, because walking my daughter to school set myself up mentally to have a really good start to the morning, encouraging, walking with my daughter, but also being able to get some beautiful sunshine on my face, get some fresh air, and set myself up mentally to tackle the day of chemotherapy. Now, the other piece of it that I do believe played a huge role for me was nutritionally. I actually fasted for chemotherapy. Have you heard of this before, Kenny? Have you heard of fasting for chemotherapy?
Did you say fasting for chemotherapy?
Yes.
No, talk to us about that.
Yeah. So there's a lot more data and research coming out. It's definitely in the US, especially, it's not standard practice, but more and more people are doing it. So the research that's coming out, not super conclusive. And I also need to say that it's not appropriate for everybody. Okay. So somebody definitely needs to talk to their doctor, their dietitian, whatever it might be, to see, is this appropriate for me? However, the research is showing that fasting may be beneficial for people during the course of chemotherapy to help reduce side effects from the chemotherapy. Okay. And that's the biggest outcome that we see from it. So it is not eating or eating a small amount of calories or a water only fasting for a certain particular set of hours before chemo and after chemo. And I chose to do this, and it was interesting. So where I was treated for my cancer was actually, I mentioned in the beginning that there was a cancer center that I developed, grew, and ran the nutrition program for. That was the same treatment center that I was treated at. So I had left that cancer center to pursue my own private practice that I currently run, but I was diagnosed there and treated there. So my oncologist was my colleague, my previous colleague, right? So he knew me as a dietitian, he knew me as a professional, right? And so I remember going into my oncology appointment where we were setting what the plan was for chemotherapy. And I had like all my research in my hand, right? Of like, this is the research for fasting, because I wanted him to approve it too, right? I also, even though I'm an oncology dietitian, I had reached out to my oncology dietitian colleagues to say, this is what I'm thinking about doing. What are your thoughts? What things do I need to make sure? Because even though I know those things, I wanted to hear it from somebody else too. So anyways, it was kind of funny because when I told him what I wanted to do, and I was like handing him the research, he was like, Alison, I trust you. I know how you practice, and you should do what you think is right. And so I chose to fast for chemotherapy, and it was a period before chemo and after chemo. And I believe that it really made an improvement in helping me reduce my side effects so that, I was able to bounce back from that treatment sooner than others. And someone that might not be qualified for fasting is somebody that's already experiencing malnutrition. Okay. So that needs to be an assessment of the physician or a dietitian to know, so somebody's already lost a drastic amount of weight, or if during the course of treatment, they are losing a lot of weight, they should stop fasting, or the fasting needs to be modified. However, overall in the fasting research, it does show weight maintenance and most importantly, preservation of lean body mass with fasting during chemotherapy. Right. So it's a short period of time that you're fasting for, but then you're making sure you're getting your nutrition and your needs outside of those fasting periods before you come back for your next chemotherapy. So I believe that played a huge role in my nutrition approach. But then also, I am also a big believer in plant-forward nutrition. And the reason why I'm a big believer in that is because that's what the research says. That's what the research shows in terms of how do we support our bodies to help reduce the risk of cancer through treatment and into survivorship. So I like to call it plant predominant, plant forward. Everyone seems to have a little bit of a different definition of it. And for those listening, it does not mean that somebody needs to be a vegan or vegetarian. But what it does support is a high amount of whole, unprocessed, plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes, and some nuts and seeds. So someone can be absolutely incorporate small amounts of animal products, whether that be meat or fish or eggs, whatever it might be. But when we're predominating the diet with these whole plant-based foods, we get a ton of phytochemicals, which are these plant nutrients that have been shown to have anti-cancer properties, help prevent DNA damage, help prevent DNA repair, or help repair DNA that's already been damaged, reduce inflammation, regulate hormones. I mean, there's so many great advantages to it. And so we're incorporating a large amount of those foods when possible. So when I'm working with my patients, for example, broccoli and cruciferous vegetables are some of the best cancer fighting foods you can incorporate. However, if my patient's experiencing diarrhea, I'm going to actually tell them, don't eat cruciferous vegetables until we can get that diarrhea under control. And then we'll reintroduce that, right? So it's kind of those changes as time is going along. And so that's really like, I guess, in the big picture of the things that I really focused on was really getting my mindset right. Fasting for chemo was very helpful for me as an individual, and plant predominating my diet as much as possible when possible. And I also want to make the quick note that when we talk about a plant predominant diet, we're not talking about like vegan junk food, right? That's like vegan ice cream and alternative meats and so forth. We're talking about fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes, because they are different, right? Just because someone eats Oreo cookies or white pasta that are vegan or plant-based doesn't make them nutritionally appropriate type of foods. So does that help give you an idea of kind of how I came into my treatment protocol and how I supported myself?
That was definitely a nice round overview. Quite a bit of information. Quite a bit of information, right? I mean, it can be complicated. And so because I think what happens, what I have seen is when someone gets diagnosed, they want to try to do everything now, right? Instead of taking the baby steps to get to where they need to, because they're fighting. They're fighting for survival. They're fighting to get better. And they're fighting to get this thing behind them. So it's only natural that you want to try to introduce everything. But how would you walk someone who is newly diagnosed into taking these baby steps and what they can do first? What would you say to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree that, when we're facing that diagnosis, so many of us want to do everything we can at that moment, right? And I also agree with you that the small baby steps, these are the most sustainable long-term changes, right? When you can get used to that. So my overall biggest approach for people when they're first diagnosed and wanting to do everything, but kind of want to try to slow them down a little bit if I think that's appropriate. Like there are very select few of people that they can just turn everything over 180 degrees overnight. But these are people, they have certain types of internal motivations, but they also have a huge support group and huge resources, etc. But my biggest approach is focusing on adding necessarily before you subtract. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of talk in the cancer space about what foods cause cancer. And I'm putting this in quotes because we do know and we do have data that shows certain foods do increase our risk for cancer development. But eating that one food or one food in and of itself is not going to cause cancer. Just like one food in and of itself is not going to prevent or cure cancer. Right? So trying to focus on the fact that if we can focus on adding these nutritious foods to what you're already doing, then we'll start to crowd out those not so great foods over time. Right. And I oftentimes tell my clients that I have a method to my madness, meaning that I think it's really important for me to teach them why I make certain recommendations. But when I make certain recommendations, there's usually a little underlying strategy in it, meaning okay, if I can ask you, okay, you're going to have, let's say you're having something simple. Let's say you're having a sandwich. Okay. And on that sandwich, I might ask you, do you have lettuce? Do you have tomato? Can we add these whole plant-based products to that sandwich before necessarily taking the full sandwich away that you're used to consuming, right? So if we can do that, well, I know as a dietitian that when we're adding lettuce and tomato, let's say onion to this food, they're going to be more full because they have fiber, they have the water content, and they might not be as hungry to consume the chips that are on the side, right? So it's really focused on adding these foods before subtracting. And when someone's ready to subtract or reduce or eliminate a certain food from their diet, then we kind of do that along the way. But simply research shows that if we just add these foods and these really great properties, it can do a really great job to support us.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for walking us through that and helping us to appreciate, it's the adding before we subtract. That's a nice strategy as you move forward. And so we're saying this, and I wanted to pause, Alison, for this because I don't want you to be overwhelmed. You already have a lot on your plate, whether you're the patient, whether you're the family member or a caregiver, there's a lot on everyone's plate. So we want to make sure, how do we simplify, but at the same time, move in a direction that's going to benefit us or benefit those around us. So thank you, Alison, for pointing that out and breaking it down for us that way. So for you, Alison, here you are, you went through X amount of weeks of treatment. You had surgery, double mastectomy, all of these things. At what point did you start implementing your nutrition? And at what point, and were you tweaking that along the way?
Yeah, great question. So I will say that I had a really pretty, I don't want to say awesome, but I had a really pretty good diet going into treatment. And I had over the years been slowly changing my diet to be more plant-based, right? More whole foods. Right now I'm 35, like the 15-year-old me that would see what I eat today, like all the veggies and all the things that I wouldn't have even touched when I was 15, right? Is like crazy to think about that transformation. So like I did do it over time and I led into that. And, one thing about my surgeries, I had surgery first. And I also live very close to one of the hospitals here. And so because the DIEP flap has that really big abdominal incision, walking, standing up straight, holding anything is pretty hard for a really long time. It's a really long recovery surgery. Well, 2 weeks after my surgery, I walked to the hospital for my 2-week follow-up. And I walked with my husband, right? And it's probably maybe a half a mile away as well, not really far. And I got there and my surgeon said, "You did what?" And I said, "Well, my husband's here and I had my dad on standby in case like he had to come pick me up and I couldn't walk back or something like that." Right. And she said, which now I'm telling all your listeners, right? But she said, "Don't tell anyone that you did that because you're going to make this surgery look really easy." And the reason I do actually share that is not to boast about, "Oh, I walked and I did this," but to highlight how much our nutrition and our lifestyle can make a difference in our healing, right? And that's what my surgeon did credit to. She's like, you're physically active, you're healthy going into this, right? Now, many people don't have the opportunity to like really get their nutrition and lifestyle set up before they go into their cancer surgery, right? So I had the advantage of having done that for many years, right? I've always been physically active and so forth. So I like to encourage people to really focus on what can you do today and what can we build on that, right? And so I think that what I did before was really helpful leaning into it. Now, during the course of treatment, how I changed things was truly as needed day by day situation. And I think that's partly why it's so important to have an oncology dietitian part of your cancer team and part of your treatment team, is because one day you might be experiencing constipation and the next day you might be experiencing diarrhea, right? Like that's the nature of the beast of cancer and cancer treatment, right? It changes constantly. So how I got ready for those changes was really to set up my home to have those things available before treatment started or as treatment started and going into it. So for example, nausea was one thing that I experienced during the course of treatment, making sure I had ginger in my home before that chemo cycle so that I would have it right then and there to be able to use it. And then again, that comes back down to support. So if I'm working with a client that is experiencing that, and if they don't have ginger in the house, or if they don't have some of these other things that we can suggest, do they have someone that can help them get that? So it is day-to-day game time decisions, honestly. And that's where if you can have an oncology dietitian like in your back pocket, essentially, you can make those changes as you're going. It was really hard for me when patients, and they had access to me in between, but when I was working traditionally at the cancer center, and they'd be like, oh, I had just like these horrible bowel movements, a week ago. I'm like, wait, why didn't you contact me? I could have helped you like right then and there. You don't have to suffer through all of that and wait for the next appointment to happen in order for us to help you with that. So that's one of my words of advice to patients and caregivers too, is like, don't feel like you need to sit through those side effects and just experience them until you see your doctor again. Reach out to your team so that they can help give you guidance.
Yes. And for those that don't know, I mean, probably many of you do, but ginger is a way to help combat some of that nausea that you're wondering, why is she talking about ginger, right? We just think of sometimes when someone is sick, they need ginger ale, right? It's a way to settle, your stomach. And so that's what she was talking about, knowing beforehand that she was going to have this on hand. Knowing beforehand that she was going to have this on hand. That's funny.
Yeah. Well, and when I work with my clients, if they're going through certain types of treatment that I know have, like most chemotherapies or any immunotherapies, whatever it might be, right? They have this laundry list of potential side effects, right? Well, there are some that are much more known to cause like certain issues. So I don't necessarily do a lot of teaching ahead of time because everyone's going to respond to treatment differently. But there are some like particular treatments that cause mouth sores, right? So I'm going to be teaching them about a baking soda salt rinse before they have that treatment so that they know what to do at the first sign of it, right? So kind of highlighting what is most commonly an issue for those people.
Yeah, it's very interesting, as you go through these treatments, the nutritional value that you're getting by nourishing yourself is going to be phenomenal. To be able to walk and things like that to your appointments, right? I mean, that's amazing. But sometimes people are older who get diagnosed. We used to think years before that this was an old person's disease. Cancer was something that only affected older people. But now we're seeing younger patients coming in. We're seeing people who are not old. So how do they prepare themselves? So Alison, she's dropped a lot of gems here for you, and I'm so thankful for that. So, and the key point is, not everyone has a dietitian at their oncology dietitian at that, in their grips or within arm's length or a place. But now you do. Now you have a place where you have a resource, and we can reach out to Alison, who can help you and help anyone else who may be diagnosed along the way. So again, Alison, so talk to us here. So you go through your treatments, and for someone that's dealing with a head and neck cancer, head and neck cancers, as you're treating that, you can imagine how you're affecting someone's ability to swallow or, go through, sore throats. And how do you get foods down when you're dealing with something like that? How do you prepare your clients, or what advice do you give them?
Yeah, absolutely. Head and neck, I mean, no cancer is an easy cancer, right? But head and neck is a very difficult, and it is a high nutrition impact type, especially with the treatment. Just like you said, it depends on where, like if they're experiencing radiation, right? The closer it gets to the GI tract, the more nutrition side effects we tend to have. So when it comes to head and neck cancers, I've worked with a lot before. Many of them, depending on the type of cancer, will have a prophylactic tube feed placed. right? And so that it depends on the physician, it depends on the diagnoses, and then different essentially formulas will help feed that patient during the course of treatment. However, we always want to try to utilize oral nutrition as much as possible because, our throat muscles, they're a muscle. If we don't use them, they atrophy or they get weaker, right? So we do want to try to encourage oral consumption as much as possible. So some of the biggest strategies for this is making sure that we're having moist, soft foods that are a little bit easier for someone to swallow. And so a few strategies that can be helpful for that is thinking about where can we add liquids or moisture to this person's food, right? And we might not think about it a lot if we aren't experiencing that issue. So for example, could you add a gravy or a sauce to something to really get it moistened and soft to go down the throat? There's also, I mentioned previously, like a baking soda salt rinse. It's 1 cup of water, 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And you just mix it together. And then you put it in your mouth and you can swish it and kind of even gurgle it down your throat. And this can help with some of like the mouth sores or some of like the rough the rough skin and tissue like in our mouth or in our throat. So anything we can do to help alleviate some of that pain can be really helpful to make that patient more successful. And there may be a time where we need to introduce or want to consider introducing nutritional based supplements. That might be a shake or a smoothie. And how do we do that? And when it comes to the individual, and definitely taking into taste preference, because if somebody has to lean into consuming a lot of like liquid or soft foods, imagine how boring that could get over time, right? And so how do we make these foods interesting and tasty, but also nourishing for individuals that have that difficulty swallowing or chewing or getting it through their esophagus?
100%. You hit it right on the head. It can be difficult, but these things are necessary, right? I mean, you're talking about NG tubes and things like that, and 100% liquids. So many patients like, I just didn't want to eat. I don't have the desire. I'm sore, my mouth, and so this is great information, Alison. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, can I interject one more thing about that, especially if somebody is experiencing that or might be considering, like depending on where they are in their journey. One of the things that I often talk to, I don't think anybody wants to get a PEG tube, right? Because a PEG tube is one that's actually inserted into the stomach right there, right? And nobody really wants to have to get that, right? And so some people are like, I'm just going to wait until maybe I need it. And my approach was trying to help take some of the fear away from having a PEG tube for people away, or a J tube, depending on what they need to be placed. Because I like to think of that feeding tube when it's appropriate, it's a safety net, right? And when you it doesn't mean that you have to get all your nutrition there. But again, it's like breaking that cycle, that vicious cycle that we're talking about. If we can get some nourishment through a PEG tube because you're having difficulty eating, right? You're going to have more energy, you're going to have more strength that you might be able to get to eating orally sooner because you chose to have the PEG tube, right? So I think many times individuals understandably are fearful of it, or they just don't want to have to quote unquote resort to that. But it can be an incredible tool if that is the situation for someone to help support them nutritionally, because then they'll be stronger and they can recover quicker. Like there's just so many great benefits. And I have seen the people, like the difference between someone who denies a PEG tube versus someone who takes it and uses it, they bounce back from their treatment so much faster and so much stronger.
Yes. I would imagine you've seen quite a bit, right? In your being a nutritional dietitian, I've seen someone who's a dietitian that's helping people with their nutrition. Tell us a story of something that you experienced or with a client or a patient, and how food helped them, propelled them to get to that success. Maybe give us a story.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thankfully, I have a lot of great stories, but there's an easy one that comes to mind. And this was one of my patients. And it was like, man, I won't forget this ever. So he was a tonsil cancer patient. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with stage 4 initially, and he was given 6 months to live. And he didn't accept that. And so he did have a peg tube placed. And him and I became quite close because I would come and see him much every week for treatment and help him with his nutrition. So he would kind of go in and out of using his peg tube versus being able to eat orally. And this gentleman took such care and interest in his nutrition and supporting his body that, I mean, that's what we were always talking about. What can I do next? What can I do now? What can I do to make me stronger? Right. And we did that, and he outlived that 6-month prognosis by over 5 years. And I really think that it had a lot to do. I'm biased. I was his dietitian, right? To be able to help coach him with his nutrition, and because he really put that emphasis on there. And what his nutrition allowed him to do, I would say that it goes so much deeper than nutrition because he was nourished, he was able to spend time in his garden. Because he was nourished, he was able to enjoy the time with his family. Because he was strong and nourished, he was able to do X, Y, Z, right? And so to me, you have, unfortunately, a terminal illness there, right? And you're not given a lot of time, but he made the most of it with high quality of life by focusing on his nutrition. And I'll never forget that him and I became quite close. He did unfortunately pass away those about 5.5 years later after that initial diagnosis. And I went to his funeral, and it was so amazing because, gosh, I went there and his whole family was there, and I had only really met his wife before. And I walked through, and they're like, I'm sorry for your loss, all this things, right? Trying to comfort the family and just show support. And they're like, "Are you Alison?" And I was like, "Yeah." They're like, that he thought of you as his other grandchild, right? And just like this relationship that we developed over time about food, right? It was so amazing. And he did share with me, because this was a gentleman that I worked with pretty early on in my career. And he admitted to me that when I came and I met him in radiation oncology for the first time, because he was having head and neck radiation. And he said that he admitted to me that when I first walked into the room, he said, "Oh my goodness, what is this young female going to teach me? Like, there's no way I'm going to gain anything out of this." And we developed this incredible relationship and friendship. Right. And during that time, I was going through actually infertility with my husband. We were trying to start a family. Spoiler alert, we have 2 beautiful kids. So, but at the time, it was very difficult. And it was one of those things that we would talk about, how I remember him telling me, he said, "I'm going to be 85 and playing with my grandkids in the garden, and you're going to have this beautiful baby with you." And so it's just amazing, the things that cancer is such an scary, unfair, unfortunate. I mean, you could throw every bad word at it. It's horrible. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, type of thing, right? There are some beautiful things that can come from it. And I have numerous beautiful things that have come from cancer. I always say that I wish that it didn't take cancer to have that beautiful thing come out of it, but it can be beautiful. And that's why I love nutrition so much, is because that we can make us, it's a bridge to help us live an incredibly full life, being present in that beautiful life as much as possible. If that makes sense.
Yes. Well said, Allison. Thank you so much. And what a story, right? And sometimes we have some of these gems just lying in us. It's good to get them out, and those experiences, how you impacted a person's life, was shown by the family members. They know exactly who you were, right? So, we hope that this episode can help you along the way on your treatment journey, help you after your treatments, life after cancer. What does that look like? Alison dropped these gems in it. The way we eat, the things we put into our mouths, right? They say we are what we eat. There's a saying that we are what we eat. Well, what are we eating? That's a question for you. It's a personal question. What are you eating? And what are you putting into your mouth? And what can you add that's nutritional along this journey starting now? Those are questions for you. And so, Alison, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing us on here. Or excuse me. Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about and highlighting some of the benefits of nutrition. And before we let you go, is there anything you would like the listeners to know?
Wow. Is there anything that I'd like the listeners to know is that I'm going to leave it just with something that I started with earlier, was that we can't control everything when it comes to cancer. In fact, there's a lot that we can't control about it, but there are aspects that we can control. And those control aspects are our nutrition, physical activity, social connectedness, supporting our mental health. And those are the things that can help us defeat cancer in every possible way as much as possible. And so I want to leave the listeners with control the controllables and try to let the rest go.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. You do have the choice. Sometimes we talk about what is our superpower, right? We watch things and we see people out here and like we see Marvel and these superheroes, they all have a power. They all have something unique about them. Well, guess what? You also have a superpower, and that is your choice. What you choose to put in your mouth, what you choose to do along this journey, that is your superpower, and no one can take that away from you. And that's the beauty. So it's recognizing that and understanding the power of nutrition, understanding your choice and what you put your mind to. Mindset is an amazing thing. I have a course on mindset. How do you develop that? How do you develop a mindset that you're going to be winning every day? How do you develop a mindset that's positive, that's going to get you through the day, not only here through treatments, but beyond? The things that we say, the things that we do to ourselves matter. What you say to yourself in the morning matters. Mindset. Well, guess what? Nutrition is just it's another part of that. It's another part of that mindset. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Alison, for joining us. And as I always say to everyone, you're not alone in this. We're in this together. This is Kenny Perkins, AKA your cancer guy. Until again.
So stay connected with us on All Talk Oncology Cancer Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to that, right? Wherever you listen to your podcast, whether that's Apple, Spotify, make sure you subscribe and continue to spread that word, right? Engage in this, because your engagement can help someone stay alive. And this is what we're talking about. So again, make sure you subscribe, hit that subscribe button. Again, this is Kenny Perkins, aka your cancer guy. Until again, I'm out.